Greetings, everyone. Greetings, everyone, wherever you are in the world. A warm welcome to all of you who have made the time to attend our inaugural joint webinar on the Republic, a public matter, legal and economic perspectives for constitutional change in Jamaica. This represents the first in a series of discussion forums to be hosted that will examine the interface between law, economy, and our development trajectories. Our intervention today represents a special collaboration between the Institute of Law and Economics and the University of the West Indies through the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social Economic Studies, the Department of Government, and the Mona Faculty of Law. I am Dr. Patricia Northover. I define myself as a Black critical theorist, development economist, and senior research fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute, otherwise known as SLISES. As a co-organizer, I'm helping to lead this project of public engagement and education on the challenges facing our region's nation-states and its peoples. Indeed, as we are confronted by the Gaza and the Haitian crisis, as well as the Venezuela-Guyana territorial disputes, all painful reminders of the multiplying untenable states that we live in, there is a clear need to think about our political legacies and how to transform them. Moreover, framed as we are by our context of global, regional, and local crises, there's an increased worldwide consciousness that a change is needed from business as usual in all modes of governance. But how can we catapult ourselves from the old into the new? Today, we invite you to join us in a critical dialogue on the Caribbean state and their role in constraining or enabling alternative futures. This is a conversation that our institute, SLISES, will lead in its 25th annual conference from May 1 to 3rd, 2024, that's next year in Jamaica at the regional headquarters at the university. Our conference theme is translating thought into action towards decolonial equity and justice in the Caribbean. We begin these conversations now with the lens on Jamaica and its own steps towards a republic in that open and unfinished process of decolonization in the 21st century. Our proceedings will be guided today by our colleague and moderator, Dr. Leslie Kelly, who is a retired major of the Jamaica Defense Force and a lecturer in the Department of Government of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of the West Indies, or Mona campus. He has taught undergraduate and postgraduate courses at the University of the West Indies, Mona, in international public and development management and politics since 2022. He has also taught postgraduate courses at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in the University of London's external program. I don't know how he finds the time to do all of this, but he's also a registered physiotherapist. Thanks, Dr. Kelly, for moderating today. The floor is over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Northover, for that introduction. Thank you all, and welcome on my own behalf. Welcome to this webinar. It is now my job to provide you with an overview of the webinar. And before we show you an outline of the program, I just want to talk to you a little bit about Zoom protocols. Now, the only protocol that I want to remind you of today is that when we get to the question and answer stage of the program, we are going to ask that you raise your hands to indicate that you have a question. And once you're acknowledged, you will be provided with the opportunity to engage your mic and ask the question. After you have asked the question, we are going to ask you kindly to disengage your mic because we are recording the session and we don't want any feedback. So that is the only protocol that I would flag up right at the beginning. Now I'm going to ask that we show the outline of the program. So we're going to share the outline of the program so you get a sense as to what we have in store for you this evening. I do hope that you can all see that we're at the welcome stage. Next, I will introduce the heads and they will have remarks for us. Then we will move on to an outline of the genesis of the vision of the collaboration, which will be done by Dr. Biholar. And then we will have some remarks from Mr. Gutzman on partnership for the discussion of the series and on human rights economy. We'll then move into my introduction of our main speaker, Professor Hamilton, and then we will move on to the introduction of the discussants after her presentation. We will have their engagement with us, and then we will have comments by Professor Vanos James. Around 7 o'clock, we will go into a question and answer session, and that should take roughly half an hour. After the question and answer, we will close and say thanks, and that will fall to one of the co-organizers, the head of the Department of Government, Professor Suzette Horton. So that is, in a nutshell, the program we've got planned for you this evening. So at this stage, thank you very much for, at this stage, we're going to move right on with the program. So I'm going to introduce the heads, the co-organizers of this series. And by heads, I am referring to Professor Holger Henke, who is a new director of legacies at the Mona campus. He's a long-standing scholar of Caribbean politics who has worked on issues of international relations, migration, and political culture. Professor Suzette Horton, who is the head of Department of Government in the Faculty of Social Sciences at Mona. She's Professor of Security and International Relations, and she's a fellow of the Caribbean Policy Consortium. She's a scholar of international relations theories and security threats, drug trafficking, border issues, border security, and also Dr. Christopher Malcolm, who is the interim dean of the Faculty of Law at the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies. He's a senior lecturer, he's an attorney at law, he's admitted to the bar in Jamaica and a number of other CARICOM states. He's a fellow of and certified trainer for the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, and he's formerly the Attorney General for the British Virgin Islands. So that is just, in a nutshell, the introduction of the three heads who are the co-organizers of this webinar. So I'll just now invite them to provide remarks. Professor Henke, you want to start?
Oh, thank you. I saw Suzette Horton as first person listed, but I'm fine, I can go ahead. So very good evening to all of you, and welcome to our webinar, Republic, a Public Matter, Legal and Economic Perspectives for Constitutional Change in Jamaica, to discuss what exactly does it mean and what exactly should it mean when we say that Jamaica will get a new constitution, will become a republic, will divorce itself from the British Crown, from the United Kingdom Privy Council, what rights should be in place to guarantee sustainable development, to face climate change and food security, to provide access to education at all levels, and a myriad of other issues. This is indeed, as Dr. Northover pointed out, just the first of several such discussions. And I thank the leadership and participation of our senior fellow, Dr. Patricia Northover at Salises. I thank the Department of Government and the Faculty of Law. I thank the Institute of Law and Economics and Dr. Rosalia Hamilton, our speaker this evening. I also want to thank the other two panelists, Ms. Danielle Archer from the National Integrity Action and Professor Vannes James. And thank you to you, our moderator, Dr. Leslie Kelly. Thanks to all of you for participating in this first leg of our conversations. This is timely, not only because we have started the public hearings and conversations in the communities about what kind of constitutional change we should expect and which one we should demand. Let's be clear, a new constitution is a watershed moment in Jamaica's history. It happens not even just once in a lifetime. To get this right, to lay solid new foundations, we need to talk about the past, understand and be frank about the present, and try to anticipate what the future holds. In this bright future, you can't forget your past, Bob Marley told us. Well, the future just arrived at our doorstep. Just this past weekend, Professor Trevor Monroe wrote an article in The Gleaner pointing out not only the achievements of independence, but reminding us of the work that remains to be done. Issues such as states of public emergency not be declared and used to infringe on the rights of our people in a manner that cannot be demonstrably justified, or to give constitutional protection to our electoral commission, the Office of the Public Defender, and the Office of the Political Ombudsman, to mention just two that were highlighted in his article. So there's much to be explained and discussed, and I just look forward to the presentation and the discussion afterwards. Thank you and welcome again.
Thank you, Professor Henke. Prof. Horton, any remarks?
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Kelly. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good evening. On behalf of the Department of Government, I'm particularly excited to warmly welcome all of you today to our forum, A Public Matter, Legal and Economic Perspectives for Constitutional Change in Jamaica. Over the past 4 years, the Department of Government has forged research relationships and has participated in many public forums with internal and external stakeholders. Today, it is partnering with UWI Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, Salises, Mona Law, Faculty of Law, and the Institute of Law and Economics to bring a discussion on the topical forum of Jamaica's constitutional reform. This is indeed a historic process for Jamaica, and I'm happy that we're discussing this matter today. Welcome again to all of you who are participating in the forum, whether as organizers, as the moderator, as the presenter, and of course, you, the audience. And I look forward to an academically stimulating forum. I thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Horton. Is Dr. Malcolm? Is he with us?
I'm not seeing him online, so you have to proceed.
Okay. All right. It doesn't seem that Dr. Malcolm is with us, but now we will move on. I will introduce Dr. Ramona Biholar and Mr. Dwayne Gottsman. Dr. Biholar is a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Law of the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies. She is a socio-legal scholar who focuses her teaching, research, and publication on international human rights law and implementation of human rights treaties, gender, and the law in the Commonwealth Caribbean, the right to development, and reparatory justice. Since 2014, she has concentrated her regional work on building and strengthening capacity of Caribbean governments and civil society organizations on human rights and state obligations and reporting on the United Nations human rights treaties. Mr. Dwayne Gottsman, he holds an MBA in finance and other undergraduate and postgraduate degrees, and is currently the Chief Executive Officer at the Institute of Law and Economics. He has a passion and commitment for the development of community, and he focuses in this passion largely on community practices and partnerships with youth empowerment, and this passion has thrust him into numerous leadership positions, ranging from President of the Junior Chamber International, Jamaica, Dean of the CARICOM Youth Ambassadors Program, and member of the Labor Market Reform Committee. He's a lifelong learner who, through the design and implementation of social impact projects, seeks to make a significant contribution to the advancement of entrepreneurship, innovation, and business development in Jamaica, more so among young people. Dwayne is guided by the mantra, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." That is, of course, drawn from Philippians 4, verse 13. So at this juncture, I'll ask Dr. Ramona Biholar, and then followed by Mr. Dwayne Gottsman, to give an overview of the initiatives.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this webinar. I'm happy to share some of the larger context for the discussion series, which starts today with this webinar. The series is a reflection of the collaboration between the University of the West Indies at Mona campus and the Institute of Law and Economics as one of the external partners for a larger project on the human rights economy. This is a concept that places emphasis on economic, social, and cultural rights that seem to be less employed than civil and political rights. In fact, based on reporting patterns, United Nations authorities are indicating a failure of nations around the world to utilize these rights in their economic and social policies. And such failure resulted in business models, trade and investment decisions, and economic policies that contributed to a number of issues that the world faces, including climate emergencies, marginalization of communities, increased poverty and inequalities. The COVID-19 pandemic, overlapping with multiple crises from climate change to geopolitical instability, urged the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to issue a challenge for nations to design human rights economies that prioritize investment in economic, social, and cultural rights in order to tackle structural barriers to equality, justice, and sustainable economic activity and growth. The High Commissioner particularly stressed that a human rights economy, and I quote, "will deliver better results for people and planet because beyond profit, it is grounded in everybody's rights," end of quote. So a human rights economy is fundamentally about, one, returning to the core values of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, meaning respect for and employment of all rights supported by the principles of non-discrimination, equality, equity, dignity, and solidarity. Second, properly applying human rights state obligations and standards to economic, social, and environmental policies as intended in the declaration and the treaties that followed it, particularly the 1966 International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and its twin treaty, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Third, a human rights economy is about centering individuals, peoples, communities, and the planet in these economic, social, and environmental policies, and reasserting in this way the commitment to global sustainable development goals. Inspired by this concept on the human rights economy, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights joined efforts with UNESCO, United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, to create and call for the establishment of a one-of-a-kind set of chairs on the human rights economy to support universities' work around this concept. The University of the West Indies at Mona is in process of seeking to join this worldwide project and contribute from a Caribbean, decolonial, and multidisciplinary perspective to further defining and critically operationalizing the human rights economy. Concretely, it is envisioned to engage through teaching, training, research, and community participation in interrelated discussion, critical discussions like the one tonight, on a necessary basis for sustainable development and just societies, including, but not limited to, gender justice, action to climate justice, economic, social, and cultural rights-oriented policy, digital development, community empowerment through creative learning and online systems. One specific component of this large project is the establishment of a UE Human Rights Economy Research Cluster composed of critical stakeholders at the university here, as well as university's partners, such as the Institute of Law and Economics, to support innovation in research, teaching, training, and knowledge translation. The discussion series initiated today is part of this larger project, given that just this weekend, on the 10th of December, the Universal Declaration turned, like University of the West Indies, 75 years old. And I would like to add the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man is a couple of months older than the Universal Declaration. This timely seminar is also a reassertion of this landmark human rights instrument. Now, further background on the discussion series. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you so very much, Ramona and the rest of the team for the platform on which to speak about this discussion series. It's quite timely, and actually since 1998, the Institute of Law and Economics was established to foster collaboration, innovation, public discussions and education around issues that juxtapose legal and the economic profession. And so this multidisciplinary approach that we have here, and the audience will get to experience this evening, is something that we are super big on. ILE works towards this through trainings and workshops, debates, non-partisan and democratic discussion, all with the aim of allowing the average person to be able to follow and understand issues of national importance. And given where we are now, this is an issue of national importance, and we want pretty much everybody to be on board and understand the different and nuanced views that there as it relates to the constitutional reform process. It's in that respect that the paper that's prepared by our founding director, Professor Rosalie Hamilton, dubbed Legal and Economic Perspectives for Constitutional Change. And this discussion series is very timely and, if I may say so, super relevant. And the collaboration with UE, in particular, the SLESIS, or Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies, the Department of Government, and the Mona Faculty of Law is relevant because each of these departments that we mentioned reach different segments of our population. And certainly ILE is in the nooks and cranny, like some of these departments as well, being able to allow persons from varied backgrounds to be in on this discussion. While I look forward to this afternoon's discussion though, Ramona, I'm equally anticipating and awaiting discussions 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. From my reading and just research, the road to Republic does not come with a roadmap. And if the road is anything like the road that we have here in Jamaica, it's bumpy. And so we're going to have discussions like this to smooth it out, to ensure that persons are able to come along the journey. We're going to have some differences. We're going to make some left turns and right turns. But in the very end, we ought to reach a destination that all of us can be pleased with. So discussions and collaborations like these provides well-needed signposts and traffic signals along the journey. And so we invite everybody on the call. And certainly if you look and you don't see a friend here, or if a friend is supposed to be here and you think that this is a conversation and discussion that they would benefit from, please send them the link so that they can jump on before we dive into the meat of the matter. Welcome again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and you're in for a real treat. I turn it over to you, moderator.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Gutzma. And also thanks to Dr. Bihola. Now it is my job to introduce the main speaker. So I'll give you a very short biographical sketch of our main speaker this evening. Professor Rosalie Hamilton is a social scientist and advocate for sustainable development. She was vice president of the University of Technology from 2008 to 2018. And she held the professorial chair from Scotiabank in entrepreneurship and development. She established and led the Micro, Small, and Medium Enterprise Alliance, the MSME Alliance, a network of small business organizations for a decade. She has also established the Institute of Law and Economics and worked as a consultant and public educator on trade, governance, gender, and other areas of economic and social development. She has taught at the graduate and undergraduate levels in Jamaica and in the United States of America. She was special advisor and trade policy consultant in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade from 2000 to 2003. And she served as chief advisor to the Prime Minister of Jamaica from May 2006 until September 2007. So without further ado, I will welcome Professor Rosalie Hamilton. Professor?
Thank you so much, Dr. Kelly. Colleagues, friends, advocates for change, fellow Jamaicans, everyone listening to this website, this webinar. Good evening. You know, I was motivated to write this paper on legal and economic perspectives for constitutional change because there's a question that has been reverberating across Jamaica. Many Jamaicans are asking, how will this constitutional change affect my life? How will it improve how I live every day? How will it improve my standard of living? Am I going to be better off? And the question has persisted for some time because I think there's been inadequate focus on interface between the legal and economic perspectives in our discussion around constitutional change. Many lawyers, in fact, simply argue that constitutional change cannot fix all social and economic problems. They are separate issues, and that economic policy deals with those matters. We at the Institute of Law and Economics sees it quite differently. We see these issues are very interconnected, and we now have a unique opportunity to contribute to this interrelated perspective that we see as important in shaping a new constitution as we move towards a Jamaican Republic. I just want to start by talking a little about our economy and using the perspectives from the Caribbean's only Nobel Prize winner in economics, Arthur Lewis. And he got his Nobel Prize for citing, among many things, an important observation about our economies, that our economies with surplus labor do not work like economies that have abundant capital. And this idea that the operations of a free market economy in the West has abundance of capital, they can assume the production and use of capital as a normal way in which their economies operate, is an assumption that we can't take lightly. In fact, when we're talking about capital, we're talking about the goods and services that are used in the production of other goods and services. And an important feature of developing economies like Jamaica is that we do not produce and use enough capital relative to our competitors. And this is a point that Professor James has spent much of his professional life focusing on, emphasizing that we must pay attention around what it takes to build up the scale of capital production of goods and services in order to compete in the modern world. So the central role of capital is critical. And if we're in a capitalist economy, and we are, and a capitalist global economy, then capital production and accumulation is central. And so our objective must be, how do we restructure our economy to produce adequate levels of capital and accumulate capital to achieve the social and economic objectives that we want, to achieve what you heard earlier as referred to as the human rights economy. How we restructure the economy we have matters. Not only is it important that we have the right type of policies, but that the policy-making process is key to economic restructuring. So I want to talk about these two things, the kinds of policies that we need to be thinking about and the policy-making process that takes us into the conversation around the Constitution. Now, when we think about the policies that ought to be our focus, I think we should think about them in terms of the objective of economic policy. Do we want an economy that serves the interests of the majority of our people? Do we want an economy that is fair, that's equitable, that's just? And do we want an economy in which the standard of living is comparable to that of the rest of the world? And if that's really what we're aiming at, if we want economic policies to achieve these objectives, then we must focus on how to achieve the growth of GDP and GDP per capita in particular, which is a proxy, a fairly good measure, the measure economists use for a standard of living. Let's reflect a little on that. The real GDP per capita has grown less than 1% since our independence in 1962. That's profound. In fact, in 2019, the GDP per capita was $5,308 US. That's nearly 10 times lower than the typical GDP per capita in developed countries. It's about $50,000 US. That's the estimate for that year in 2019. In 2022, our GDP per capita fell even lower, $5,187. So we really are not at the level we ought to be with respect to standard of living. And when you hear Jamaicans saying, how is this, all of this constitutional change going to affect the price of bread? How is it going to make me better off? It's essentially what is at issue. The sectors that produce, that with the capacity to produce the kind of capital that can contribute to the growth of GDP in contributed about 49% of GDP in 2019. And that's estimated to be well below the benchmark of about 65% of GDP in developed economies. And we have estimated that it would take an annual growth rate of more than 6% for the next 40 years to achieve the GDP per capita of the average developed countries in 2019, right, of about $50,000 US. Now, remember, the standards across the world are growing every year. So $50,000 US in 40 years is not going to be the standard. It's going to be much higher. And so we have to ramp up the restructuring of our economy in a significant way. And therefore, the legal framework to do this is critical. So it is this inadequate capital accumulation process, the extent to which we need to improve our GDP per capita, that I think is at the heart of the kinds of protracted underemployment that we see. Although we have a high employment rates, there's still a lot of underemployment, low wages, increasing crime, and we're seeing continued emigration to developed countries where Jamaicans are in search of better standard of living. Many Jamaicans would stay here if they could eke out a living that matches their own expectation of how they want to live and how they want to live with their families. Now, looking at evidence across 128 countries across the world, work that myself and Professor James have done, we looked at policies trying to understand what it takes to grow GDP per capita. And three things stood out. And I think it's important in the beginning to shape the kinds of policies that we want. One, it's important to increase that capital share of GDP. It's important to increase the export of capital goods and services, especially our services. And we are a highly import-dependent country. And so if we're going to reverse that on a sustainable basis, we need to increase the share of exportable capital in GDP and do much more in the areas of education and healthcare and creative industries, arts and so on. We've been talking about it for a long time. I think we need to do much more in that respect. We must also increase the capacity to innovate. What we see is that our system of education and training to foster creativity and innovation is lacking. It's not there in the school system. In fact, the focus is much more on conforming to rules than it is highlighting, enhancing creativity and innovation. And the third strategy and set of policies speaks to upgrading key institutions that are required to foster creativity, innovativeness, and enable us to export and build the kind of capital base that we need to be globally competitive. And the current institutions that we have, I think generally we can describe as not fit for purpose. It's rooted in outdated colonial systems, especially our education system, and we're not seeing the kinds of outcomes that we want. So if we want market forces to facilitate growth and development in economies like ours, in which we have capital shortages, we can't simply rely on the free market and assume that the market forces will enable us to achieve the outcomes we want. We must redesign and think carefully about the policies for economic restructuring to achieve the improvement of standard of living and to create this human rights economy that many of us think is important for us to move in that direction. But even if we have the best of policies, evidence-based, we're on the right track with respect to these policies, is that good enough? We've had 60 years of experiences, good policies written in different areas around different things, but they go nowhere because they're not politically expedient enough to get achieve outcomes that politicians want, or there may be corrupt decisions that trump the kinds of evidence-based decisions that we may think is in our best interests. And so the type of policy making process matter. What is that process of policymaking? And that's where I think we have to look again at our constitutional and legal framework. We've inherited a very highly centralized policymaking process, and it essentially thwarts the voice of the majority of Jamaicans. And this includes the kinds of economic actors in the sectors that I mentioned, you know, whether it's the health sector, those creative sectors, where we need to be innovative in order to be able to compete globally. When we thwart the voices of these economic actors because they don't fit into a certain class, they don't flex with, you know, the power brokers in the country, and so on, when we shut their voices out, then we limit our economic opportunities. And we make decisions, and we will continue to make decisions if we don't change what we have with very limited information. The current policymaking process is dominated by the choices of the politicians and technocrats who are in the ministries, departments, and agencies. And these decisions tend to be devoid of the perspective of Jamaicans in communities who have their own experiential knowledge of how some of these policies are working. And there's no adequate mechanisms to hear about the effectiveness and the impact and implications of the policies that are in play. And so it is this kind of policymaking process that we want to interrogate. And when we think about it through the lens of the Constitution, there are two elements that I think are important. One is the extent to which there are adequate mechanisms through which the people's voice can be heard. Do we have an inclusive decision-making process that can enable us to make better economic decisions? That's on the one hand. On the other hand, do we have adequate oversight mechanisms in place to ensure that our Prime Minister and the Cabinet, when these decisions are made, they are scrutinized and represent the best of what we can offer and certainly represent the will of the Jamaican people? I think if we tackle these two issues, we'll go a long way. And so constitutional reform that can address these issues, that ultimately will require the change in the structure of government, not simply change in the head of state, but looking at the entire structure of government, how we make decisions, I think will take us further along where we need to go. And so I'm going to quickly talk about some of the key elements in the design that I suggest in the paper, and the paper is posted on the Salises website, of the kind of restructuring of government around 5 key areas that could make a difference. The first is the restructuring of Parliament itself, the restructuring of the House of Representatives to ensure that there's adequate oversight and accountability of the executive, and that the non-executive legislators are in charge of the legislative process, and that we have improved participatory governance. And I think that if we look at 3 key things, the size of the executive relative to the legislature, we look at the oversight committees and make sure that they function and do oversight. And we also empower citizens through petitioning that can take us a long way down restructuring a House of Representatives that can be more, not just participatory, but provide the kind of oversight to the decisions that we now see that are essentially unfettered. We should also look at restructuring our Senate. And I suggest that we should elect our senators to strengthen the voice of the Jamaican people in Parliament and to ensure that there are equitable access to development opportunities across parishes. There's a lot written in the paper around that, and it speaks to the kind of spatial inequalities that we see in our society and the extent to which perhaps rethinking the role of the Senate and electing Senate through these geographical lenses perhaps could give us some better outcomes. With respect to our locally appointed head of state, I think there is, in my mind, much too much emphasis on the elected versus non-elected head of state. The discussion there misses an important point, that if you have an elected head of state and you have no prime minister, because there are different versions of the head of state, you can have an elected head of state and an elected head of government. But if you had, which some people are arguing for, an elected head of state without a head of government, then you are concentrating more power in the hands of one individual. And so it begs the question, is there adequate mechanisms for constraints with respect to the amount of power in the hands of that head of state? And a recent poll that talked about the Jamaicans wanting an elected head of state also said in that poll that Jamaicans want less power in the hands of the prime minister. So we ought to be very careful about that move. We also need to move towards improving our judiciary. There's a lot of discussion taking place right now about the full accession to the jurisdiction of the CCJ, the Caribbean Court of Justice. I think it's high time. There's a lot of discussions there, so I won't go into much more detail. But this is important for the evolving regional jurisprudence that is important in not only shaping the kinds of legal outcomes that we want, but the social and economic outcomes as well. We must also strengthen our public service. And so we've had a kind of, the whole idea of the independence of the public service and special protection for offices like the Office of the Public Defender, the Electoral Commission of Jamaica, the Office of the Political Ombudsman, and Integrity Commission. All of these we see as important in ring fencing, if you like, the kind of independence and technical professional services that are important in supporting the executive function of government. And so those protections ought to be in the Constitution. There's a lot to be said about strengthening local government. And we ultimately want a system of local government in which our local representatives can ensure that the communities have access to the kind of social and economic policies that they can influence. And a big part of that is the extent to which citizens in community can actively participate in shaping budgets that affect them. So participatory budgeting is also part of that discussion about how we in fact can create opportunities to practice direct democracy and ensure that individuals and communities can shape policies that directly address their needs. So it is this comprehensive approach to changing the inherited structure of government that I think will matter and in this discussion about how constitutional changes affect people's lives. It's not simply tackling the head of state. The majority of Jamaicans, I think for the first time in our history, will move to a place where we feel we own Jamaica. Jamaica belongs to us. And if we take this ownership seriously and we use constitutional provisions, as I've suggested about, being able to have hearings and petition that gives you a chance to go and make your presentation around any issue that you choose these kinds of actions. Once we have them in place, Jamaicans must act. If we really see that we own Jamaica, this and we want sovereignty, then if we see this as important, we have to actively get involved. And so it is when we do that, we can influence in a direct way decisions that affect our lives. And we've been talking about this idea of inclusive decision-making that affect our life for decades, we actually need the constitutional and legal framework that we can to do so. So in wrapping up, let me just say that this change of the structure of government, change in inherited structure of government, I think is important to really end this decolonization process. It's not just moving the head monarch as head of state. I think we also must see that linked to that structure of a top-down approach to governance is an old colonial style governance that we perpetuated, where power hands in the hands of a few. And we've made not enough changes of that structure since our independence. So I think for us to achieve this, however, there must be the active engagement of informed citizens. And so there's been a lot of discussion about the need for public education, information sharing. I commend Salisa's UWI, ILE, the entire team that is putting this kind of forum together, because these are the kinds of initiatives that's important to share information, to exchange ideas, so that we can actively get involved. It will take time. It will not happen overnight. In my mind, if we invest in this redesign of the structure of government, it is likely to be the most important human capital investment ever undertaken to not just transform governance, but the economy of Jamaica since our independence. And I think that this is an important move for us. It is an intergenerational conversation about what it will take to move in the direction of lifting the standard of living of our people, and to put that legal framework in place. In fact, since 1838, our people have been ready for the legal and economic changes that are required. And so for every generation, we have to ask ourselves, how will we do it? I hope that the perspectives I've shared this evening and is embodied in the paper will help us to find more of these solutions through the lens of law and economics, to push our society in the direction we want, to create an economy in which the standard of living of our people can be improved, and that ultimately we can achieve the governance framework that we are. I am confident, in fact, that we can get there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hamilton, for that wonderful sharing of ideas. I am certainly going to have a look at the paper, and you might get an email with a few questions from me at that juncture. But thanks a lot for that. At this juncture, I'm going to introduce Professor Varnus James, who is our main discussant this evening. We had put on the program Miss Danielle Archer as the other discussant. I understand that she was trying to join us. I'm not sure if she has, but I'll say who she is in the hopes that she will join. So it's Miss Danielle Archer, who is the Principal Director of National Integrity Action, the anti-corruption watchdog, as it were. And I will then move on to Professor Varnus James, who is a former senior policy advisor with the United Nations Development Programme and World Intellectual Property Organization international consultant. He also served as Senior Research Fellow in the Scotiabank Chair in Entrepreneurship and Development and Adjunct Distinguished Professor of Economics, Econometrics at the University of Technology, Jamaica. Professor James is the author of 3 World Intellectual Property Organization reports measuring the contribution of copyright-based industries to Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and the OECS, as well as author of the UN ECLAC manual, the design and conduct of public expenditure reviews in Caribbean countries. He is also the co-author of the recently published book, Competing for Development, Essays on the Self-Sustaining Growth of Caribbean Economies. The central thesis of his published works in referred journals and books is that the main development problem of Caribbean countries is that the domestic capital sector is too small. So, without further ado, I will ask Professor James to address us.
Thanks a lot, Leslie. And let me begin by, perhaps the best thing to do is begin by saying you're not missing anybody when you don't get your second discussant, because you have 38 distinguished discussants waiting to participate. So you won't be short of opinions on the forum tonight. Prof. Hamilton covered a rich range of issues that I won't go down the road of trying to comment on all of them. By and large, I agree with the basic thrust of her analysis. I will focus on just three components that I want to perhaps clarify some issues around, if this agenda that Prof. Hamilton is laying out could be made to work. The first of them is that we're going to have to come up with a way to forge agreement among our political elite and between the political parties about the nature of the democracy we're going to try to build. One of the reasons that's important is that for the system that she's talking about to function, you're going to need a certain kind of easy relationship between the way the political parties work in the normal conduct of their own business and the way the parliament works. Let's take the simple example of a case where the parliamentary reps that she's talking about, the leaders of the ruling party in the parliament, restructured as Prof. Hamilton suggests. Let's take the case where those leaders want to remove the prime minister from office, as the constitution allows. Those leaders in the parliament are going to need to have a channel to their political party to get the political party to remove the prime minister as head of the party. And if you don't get that to work, you're going to have a conundrum. You'll want to vote down the prime minister in the parliament, but can't remove the prime minister as the head of the party. And the traditional link we have between the head of the party and the head of the government will effectively break down. And that will make the political process inside the parliament itself almost non-functional. So you have to have a system in place in which the political parties are set up in the same way, both of them, both of the leading parties you have now and any new ones that come up, in such a way that signals sent by the parliament, by the leaders of the parliamentary party to the country and to the party must be heard properly by the party, and the party could take the steps to decide to remove the prime minister simultaneously with the vote of no confidence in the parliament. That's going to be critical. And given the nature of the political parties we have across the region, and including those two you have in Jamaica, given the authoritarian nature of those parties, there's a lot of work to be done on that front. That's political reform, as we used to call it here in Trinidad and Tobago that's needed inside the political parties themselves. So that's something that you'll have to give some thought to. The second thing is that I think perhaps the most important point I heard from Prof. Hamilton tonight is that currently what we do is we run governments that are underinformed about what our people want to do, what they can do, and what help they need. By and large, as you would know, the basic way we inform government in these societies, apart from sniping through the media and so on, is that we collect statistical data. You know, one of our premier institutions in that regard in the region is Statin. And Statin would go out there and do a grand job of gathering statistical information and translating that into a mode of knowledge and filter that up through the various ministries to the cabinet. In my study of data, and I live processing data every day, including engaging in my work with WIPO now on design of instruments and stuff like that, one of the things you notice is that you get very limited information from that kind of scientific process. The real story of decision-making, the full information decision-making, is the decision-making that is informed by the kinds of processes Prof. Hamilton is talking about with respect to calling the society together to talk about policy-making issues, policy decisions. Those hearings that she's mentioning, that's a way to say, who come, but if you have something to say and you're interested, come and bring that information. All of the studies I've done about this hearings process, and I've participated in it in the US in an active way, tells me that you get better data from that process and fuller information to make policy from that process than you get from the statistics. So right now, in the authoritarian structure you're running the government on a half tank of information, and the other half of the tank is in the kinds of hearings decisions, the hearings mechanisms that Prof. Hamilton is describing. And until we put that in place, we'll have underinformed governments unable to put their finger on really what ought to be done on almost any policy matter. And you can't forget that sound decision-making has a meaning in the good governance environment. And that meaning is, it's kind of decisions that the public could buy into, the public wants, and the public will act on and back you up on. Once you go down the road of authoritarian decision-making, every time you make a decision, half the society is against you. And every decision activates a different half. And of course, cumulatively over time, what we've seen in the Caribbean space is that that leads to cumulatively unpopular governments until finally you get fed up with them and you just vote them out in a fit of anger. To prevent that kind of dysfunctional approach to decision-making, it makes a lot of sense to do what Prof. Hamilton is talking about and establish the full information process that allows us to get to the core of whatever we ought to do properly to drive our economy forward. And I would perhaps end my comment on that by saying that it makes sense, the point she's making about the way these economies work. When you have a large pool of undereducated workers, 60, 70%, in the case of my country, 69% not succeeding in the school system and so on. Markets don't work normally. What we in economics call the laws of competition, the mobility of resources to take advantage of differential opportunities across the country in various markets those don't function because the absence of sufficiently capitalized workers, and in particular well-educated level 4 skilled workers, the absence of enough of those shuts down the mobility process. So you need sound policy to activate the resource flow process properly. And the society cannot underplay and underestimate the importance of getting the policy process right if we want these economies to work properly. Not just Jamaica, this is true across the Caribbean space, and pretty much all of them, all of the economies. The last thing I think I should focus on has to do with one of the fundamental implications of this design that Prof. Hamilton is working with. And that is the idea of the kind of citizens we're bringing into the policy process. When I was a professor in City University in New York, in Brooklyn College, one of the experiences I had with this business of the hearings process was that citizens would come to us in Brooklyn College and ask for help. People from the Navy Yard, businesses in the Brooklyn community, businesses from the Bronx, and so on would come to the Department of Economics where I was teaching and get help. And I helped many of them to prepare testimony to take to the city council. And what that really was about is there was a little fund that would provide people like myself who got called in with a little bit of money to support the people in the community who wanted to prepare their testimony to take to the city council. Now, that was an education process underwriting the operation of their democracy in New York and funded by the state as well. And what I think that suggests to me about the Jamaican space and the Caribbean-wide space is that if we're going to get this idea of popular participation to work well, it's not going to work well if the process of participation is that people just come to the parliamentary dialogue with loose talk. They'll have to prepare properly. And the mechanisms of preparation must be put in place. You have to have ways to assist people to prepare their suggestions, prepare their documentations, present the documentations to the parliament, and explain what they have in there. That's the basis on which hearings provide better data than statistical sample surveys generated by Statin. And so we have to think about that and be prepared to put money into a robust public education program, which I would think of as perhaps was going to become your biggest development project in Jamaica. A full-fledged public education support system put in place to enable citizens to take charge of their information flows to the representatives, and the business of allowing representatives to understand what they are able to do, what they're willing to do, and what kind of help they need. If you don't put that system in place, what you will find is that the parliamentary process will reduce to what Eric Williams once called, in the language of my country, commerce government, in your language, cascas government. And what it's going to mean is the whole process of hearings that Prof. Hamilton is advocating will not work well. So if you want it to work well, you'll have to invest in your people. And in a kind of way, that's the best way to love your people. And I would perhaps wrap up with those 3 words of caution and wisdom to the panel, to the discussants here, about the wisdom of what she's talking about, but some of the critical requirements to get it to work.
Thanks you very much, Professor James. You have given us a lot to think about. And certainly, I do expect that participants will now have a chance to reflect on both what you have said and what Professor Hamilton has imparted, and that will inform the sorts of questions and that we will get in the question and answer section, which we're about to start. But before we get to that, I will just want to remind participants that we have about half an hour to take question and answers. Of course, that will depend on the fact that you have questions to ask. I'm going to ask that you raise your hand if you have a question, and then you will have the option of engaging your microphone once you have been acknowledged. All right, so at this juncture, shall we go into question and answer? So please raise your hands if you have questions, and I will call your name, and you will be given the opportunity to take the mic, ask your questions, and then please disengage your mic after you have completed your question so that we can get whether Prof. Hamilton or Prof. James or anybody else in the panel to deal with the question. All right, thank you. So raise your hands if you have a question. Victor Cummins, you have a question, you have raised your hand.
Yes, excuse me, good evening. Thank you both with the presentation. But one thing that I've been saying, I haven't heard anyone really talk about our system of governance, because to me, that is where the problem is. Yes, we were talking about changing our system of government, but to me, it's just changing the bottle and keeping the same old crappy wine. The system of governance, which involves everything, the relationship that people have both inside and outside the formal authorities and institutions of government. And I think that is what has led to the institutionalization of corruption. So that is where I would like to hear. I remember when we first started the discussion, Minister Fort Malu Fort stated there's no interest in changing the system of governance. And that is where I would like to hear. I haven't heard anybody talk about our governance system. It's all government, but government is just a part of governance, and governance is where we have the problem, in my opinion.
Thank you, Mr. Cummings. Dr. Northover, are you going to respond to the question? I see you've got your hand raised.
No, I wanted to make a comment.
Go ahead.
All right. I just wanted to counterpose a premise that Professor Rosalia Hamilton has started out her discussion on in terms of the identification of the key economic constraint facing Jamaica. And in broad terms, speaking about undercapitalization process that has stymied our growth process. And I would want to say that we need to, in a sense, decenter that discourse. I think there is not so much a lack of capital as there is an insufficiency of a harnessing of the capital resources that exist within the country because of a prioritization of different forms of capital accumulation, which are extractive, which are short-term, and which really reproduce itself based on an assumption of a cheap, low-wage, easily disposable sets of bodies that can deliver on services, that can deliver on productive activities, but which can, in a sense, not be effectively supported, invested in, to realize well-being that would be beneficial to everyone. So while I'm not a fan of sin, I just feel that in some sense, we need to change the goalposts. We can't be at this stage talking about constitutional reform and decolonization and still starting our premises with catching up to the developed economies and using growth standards as our metric for evaluating the gap between them and us. Because logically, Professor Hamilton, if we were to multiply, if every country were to multiply this effort of catching up to the advanced economies, we would have an even greater climate catastrophe. We would have unsustainable processes of consumption. We have unsustainable processes of extraction. So I don't believe that we should orientate our discussion of transformational change and a political form that will support the well-being of all people, including those things that we don't count as human, right? And this sense that you have nature over there and we can use it, and then you have human beings over here and we develop them, right? And I think those premises that we've had about the nature of the economy, the nature of the relationship between the environment, the economy, and the society needs to be unsettled. We need a decolonial process in our thinking about the economy. At least the language, yeah, the languaging of the process. So I am concerned that we don't end up constantly measuring ourselves against standards which are irrelevant for the people of the Caribbean, and that bring us into a competitive mindset of scarcity and underperformance that is not really true of the resources and the potential that exists within the Caribbean. So that would be my cautionary word in how we frame our conversations about this need to engineer a form of governance, government, state architecture that will support a certain kind of development. We need to be very clear what that form of development is. So I'm paralleling what Vanus James was saying about what kind of democracy we want. I am saying what kind of economy, what kind of development do we want?
Thank you very much, Dr. Northover. But before we progress to other questions or comments, I would like to ask either Professor Hamilton or Professor James if they would like to respond to the concern raised by Victor Cummins about the lack of mention of issues to do with governance within the ambit of this constitutional reform process.
Well, if I could just jump in on the governance front, I mean, I thought, well, when I use the term governance, we're talking about the structures and processes of decision making and accountability in government. And I think that was it's not just about the arms of government, but the very way it's structured. At the core, I pointed to two core problems: the domination of the executive in parliament, the domination by the executive of parliamentarians or legislator, and thwarting our voices in that context. Our legislators typically vote party lines and follow the leaders. And if you're on the winning side, then it is the prime minister and the cabinet that dominates those decisions. That structure has to change. And the question is, how do you change that? And the suggestion there is that we need structures that can, in fact, hold our prime minister and cabinet ministers accountable, that we have the kind of scrutiny and oversight coming out of these oversight committees, and ultimately the kinds of accountability to the Jamaican people of these decisions that are made. And in the final analysis, it is that process that we're talking about, that governance process that's at the heart of the discussion. So I'm sorry that Victor saw this as a focus on government and not the process inherited in that structure of government. On Pat's point, yes, I hear the concern about touching up standards. Unfortunately, we live in a globalized world in which, the standard of living, the things we want out of life are pretty much globalized. Many of us don't like it, but that's what you tend to see. But I think where we're going with this idea of inclusive decision making is that it provides an opportunity for the people to redefine those standards and to put policies in place that reflects a different conception of a good standard of living. If you look at some of the discussions going around, say, beach access, could we have different outcomes if, Jamaicans who want access could shape, those policies affecting the beach? We can use many different examples, but when people get involved in shaping policy, then it could and will, I think, affect the standards of how they want to live their lives. And I think it's in that sense the process will enable us to shape the kind of development that we want. Until that's done, the standards we have is what we see now in the world.
Yeah, let me, Kelly, can I come in there?
Yes, certainly, Prof.
Right, just two quick points. One is that with respect to Mr. Cummins, I would agree with him almost entirely if the substance of the point being made is that we live in an authoritarian world, in a culture in the Caribbean, and surely in the society I live in Trinidad and Tobago, completely authoritarian society. It pervades the system. It's in the schools, it's in the churches, it's in the homes, it's in the businesses and so on. One man and his dog everywhere you look. The antidote to that is mechanisms of discourse and decision making that's inclusive at every level. And when you bring that to the level of government, what you're talking about is for Jamaicans to talk to one another about what we want to do and so on. And those arrangements you can't continue to set them up in the authoritarian way that they're set up now if you want to make any kind of progress, even in the sense in which Pat means progress. Any kind of progress, you're going to need to engineer with inclusive decision making that gets all the people in the society who want to put their voice into the pool to have their say and signal their evidence and their data and so on. And that's the heart of the inheritance from colonialism and slavery. If we can't see it through those lenses, we're not going to go anywhere. In that sense, I agree with him that the heart of the story is governance. Let me just make one point about Pat's comment, which broadly speaking is heading in the right direction from this standpoint. What do Jamaicans want? And there's some compelling evidence in front of you that you have to worry about. One of the highest emigration rates in the Caribbean space, for sure, is the emigration of high-skilled people from Jamaica into the US. And you have to ask, well, why are they going? If it is that they are happy with the modest standard of living they have in Jamaica, why do they leave? Is it the authoritarian government? Why are people leaving? We got to sort through that. in any event, we need a way to hear from them what it is they really want from the point of view of the living standards. My experience in working with the SLC in Jamaica there is that most Jamaicans signal through their responses to the surveys and so on that they're interested in a much higher standard of living than they are experiencing, and we're experiencing since 1996, 97 when I was there. And I think what you have to then do is look at the evidence in front of you as to how you could achieve that higher standard of living. So when we took the WIPO data and ran the analysis across 128 countries, we were not surprised to find that there's this huge difference across the global space, right, in standards of living, in which you had the poorest countries, the lowest living standards, concentrated in certain parts of the world. So unless you have a way to turn the global structures upside down and reverse the advantages that, well, what Pat would think of as the so-called advantages that the North Atlantic countries have, you've got to deal with the fact that your people are going to abandon your society and head north, your skilled people, unless we grapple with raising living standards at home. I think that signals the need for us to talk to one another about what we mean by what Pat is discussing about the living standards and so on. We can't, it's not an academic thing. It's a people thing. It's what we, the people of the Caribbean, want as living standards. And when that is what we are delivering by the way we organize ourselves and organize our economies and so on, people will stay and help us to build our civilization. Otherwise, they'll pack their bags and do what we've seen in the past. The vast majority of Jamaicans live in the US, not in Jamaica. That can't work because that charges you a cost in the form of stagnating development processes.
Thank you, Prof. James. At this time, we would like to call on Dr. Pauline Gale Betten, and then we'll go to Althea McBean and Stephanie Marley. So I've seen your hands. I'm going to call first on Dr. Pauline Gale Betten, and then we'll move to Althea and Stephanie.
Okay, good night. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Mine is more a comment with a suggestion, not so much a question. But I just want to commend the presenters, and I'm sure everyone on the platform would have benefited in one way or the other. I have a concern, though, in terms of making a comment. What process are we putting in place as we contemplate this change for our, I'm just thinking about the average person, the average Jamaican, our grassroots persons, in terms of what are we putting in place to ensure that they too understand the process and at least have a basic idea of what a republic will look like, feels like, or even smells like. But or do we reach those other folks? Because if we get to the point, or should I say, when we get to the point where we have to vote, people tend to vote strong politically, and we really want to safeguard this change from being any political undertaking. So I just want to kind of say to caution that we need to have, see how best we can put things in place, some kind of control or something to ensure that the average person will really understand this change. Because if something good can turn out in another way if we don't understand, and then we have to vote, and we vote, in a way that hampers the change, so to speak. So that's my comment, really. But someone maybe want to respond to that. That's fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paulette, Gail, Benton. For my own part, I'll say that referenda and voting is problematic, and we should know that from our experience in the question about West Indies Federation. And elsewhere in the region, they have had referenda to decide about the retention of the monarchy in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and also in they have had referenda in Grenada and elsewhere. And referenda in the Commonwealth in general, they don't normally provide the outcomes that people think are the best outcomes. So they are very difficult mechanisms to use. At this juncture, I'm going to call on Althea McBean. You have a question, Althea?
Yes, thank you very much. Good evening, and thanks as well to both professors for that instructive lecture. My question is, in listening, and I am gathering a thread, and it's a question I've had before. Would a coalition or different type of government where we're not bound by the two-party system be beneficial to Jamaica? And I asked this, and then what constitutional process, what reform process would be required to achieve this? And I asked because I don't know, in my mind, I'm thinking that this may reduce the political strife that informs so much of politics, government, governance, both at the governmental level and also at the individual level. And one could argue that it inhibits development, economic and other types of development, because persons do so many things along party lines. And I think this has fed some of the apathy among younger voters. So that's really my question. Is that feasible? Is it possible? And could we achieve it?
Professors Hamilton or James, would you like to take that on?
Okay. Absolutely agree with Dr. Gail Benton that we need public education. It's key. How we do it is important. I know that Stephanie Marley is here, and she has been championing this idea that Jamaicans must wake up, and is in the throes of trying to get that message out in very simple ways. So my own view is that we all must play a role, that we ought not to sit and wait for government's intervention only. It's absolutely necessary, because the scale of funding that's required can really only come from government. But that we all have a role to play. And again, I want to commend the university and the collaboration with the Institute of Law and Economics in doing this, because this is just part of what is needed. And as the work that I've been doing through the Advocates Network, we've just been encouraging Jamaicans to start to have conversations in your family, with your friends. Just, you know, there's a lot of information that's accessible on the internet and so on. So just engage in the dialogue, ask questions, and that would help. So it is a big issue, and we absolutely need to do much more, especially as we move towards a referendum. So Althea McBean, you raise the issue of a coalition type government, and people talk about it in terms of proportional representation, and the issues come up all the time. My own sense is that whatever type of government, we still have this issue of how to ensure that the decisions of our legislators, the people who represent us, the people we vote for, is not dominated by the executive. So you may have other party representation and other people in government, and you break the bipartisan dominance, two parties, you have other parties and so on. That's what a proportional representation gives us. We still have the question of how do we ensure that we don't have, if you look at what is happening across the world, you see that you have coalition type governments that have difficulties forging a government because of the compromise and so on that's needed. You still bring up leaders that dominate. And so we need to focus on the mechanisms of oversight and accountability. And I think if we do that, we'll get closer to solving the problems. But the entrenched position of two parties, we've seen it again across the world, is a problem. And proportional representation may help. And there are other kinds of models, I'm sure, all over the place for different kinds of government. We have to ask some tough questions about whether we want to move to something brand new, or do we really make what we have better? And there is a discussion that we need to just throw everything out because it's not working for us. But some people argue that perhaps if we make the framework that we have better and make fundamental changes to achieve what is intended in a democracy, we may get better outcomes.
Leslie, if you look across the world, you learn something about the challenges of what you're calling coalition government, especially when it's constructed around proportional representation. Proportional representation-based electoral structures yield some of the most unstable forms of government you could ever see in the world order. And you have to think, what would you get from adding unstable government, instability in the running of the government, to authoritarianism? I mean, you're compounding the problem there. You really have to think through a proper solution. And the solution is to construct a type of parliament that allows the elected representatives of the people of Jamaica to control the executive function, ring fence it with law. And to do that properly, the leader of that effort has to be the elected non-executive reps of the winning parties. Whoever wins the election must be able to lead the parliamentary process, ring fence the executive with law, and fire the prime minister if they need to, which is what you see going on in Britain, for example. I mean, I agree with Pat that we can copy from the colonial masters, whatever it is, but you have to see grape juice when it's there and sour, and grape juice when it's good. And what you're seeing going on in Britain is that the non-executive reps on the winning side hold the future of the prime minister in their hands. So you could fire Boris Johnson and fire Liz Truss when they're incompetent. What the people of Jamaica are fed up with is incompetent government lasting for 5 years, damaging their country, and they can't do anything about it. You have to reform the structures of government to deal with that from the inside. And let me just make a point about this business of authoritarianism. Don't underestimate the damage that it can cause to your development processes. If you look across the region from Trujillo all the way to Eric Gary, to the prime ministers I've had in Trinidad and Tobago and so on, you could see with enormous amounts of resources at their disposal, all they do is make trouble for us in the region. So we've got to kill authoritarianism and create stable government in the process.
Thank you, Professor James. Stephanie Marley, are you still here? And would you like to pose your question? Is Stephanie still here? If Stephanie is not here, we will go to Jeanette Calder.
Greetings, I'm here, but I'm having a little technical problems. Can you hear me?
Yes, we are hearing you, Stephanie. Go
Okay,
ahead.
greetings. Thank
We are not hearing you at this time, Stephanie. The sound is gone.
of our nation to go and feed other nations. Are you hearing me?
Stephanie, could you start again? We didn't hear much of it. Just the last, we just caught your voice at the tail end. Could you start over?
Sure. I'm having some problems, so if it can't go through, then my apologies. But I was saying thank you to the presenters at first, and that just adding that brain drain, I think is systemic. It's a pattern, and it's been going on from the win rush. It's, you know, us feeding the nations with our labor, human resources. They want it that way. My question is there any nation where the republic exists and the people actually exercise power and it works? I'm looking for an example because I believe if we take on a republic for Jamaica, it can't just be an everyday, any republic. It needs to be something that is custom to our culture and to meeting the needs of our society. But I would love to find an example of a nation where the people actually exercise their power and it works. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Stephanie. Professors, Professor James?
Well, there are examples that we can pull, but you won't find them in the Caribbean space. I mean, what the French Revolution was about, for example, it was a people revolution that effectively drove Marie Antoinette and Louis XIV out of power, and ultimately drove Robespierre out of power as well. So people power, and then Charles I in Britain lost his neck in a kind of people power process led by Cromwell and those guys. So we've seen efforts in the global space to entrench mechanisms by which people could participate in the governance process. And you can't underplay, notwithstanding Donald Trump, you can't underplay what the Americans designed and tried to do. What Jefferson was saying in his answer, written into the American Constitution, is what that was all about is what you want to establish is a strong executive without a king. And what we have done in the Caribbean is establish strong executives as kings. So you have King Holness and King Rowley and Queen Kamala and that sort of stuff all over the Caribbean space. And we have not found a way to restrain them because we have not had the opportunity to do what my friend Pat is talking about, put ourselves at the center of the conversation and shape economy and governance and everything to suit what we want, not what anybody else says we want. So even if there is no example of what Prof. Hamilton is talking about in the whole world, if that's what we the people want, let's move and get it done, because it kills authoritarianism in the Jamaican cultural space.
And I think in that context, it's important to remember who we are. You know, we are creation. You know, we are transplanted, most of us, and you know, we created a new nation. This is a social experiment for the world. We've never quite seen what we have, and when we look through the lens of our own history, we see some problems that we have to try to fix. And the authoritarian, centralized approach, top-down approach to governance is our inheritance. And if we can't fix that, we have a problem. And so I think the confidence that I have that we can fix this problem, we can show the world what it means to create a society that is doesn't thrive on the, the oppression of the majority and thwarting the will of the majority of our people, is possible. And I think that it's important also to remember that these concepts like democracy and people sovereignty and good governance are ideals. And all of us in the world strive towards these ideals. Others have the ideals of, the status quo, that, there is no equality in the world. There will always be inequality. And, it's a survival of the fittest. And some people accept that and simply seek to perpetuate that. There are some of us who feel we can do better. And so we are going after those ideals. And I think what we're seeing in front of us, certainly in the case of America, is that it's not a linear path. You can go backward. You can take backward steps. And you have to wheel and come again. So we have to create that path. I think we have 61 years of experience since independence of what we've tried. It has not yielded the outcomes that we want. Yes, we've made progress, and we can point to a lot of things that we've done well. We're leading the world in athletics, we're creating music, we're creative and so on. But we still can do more. And I am driven by the confidence in our people that as good as we think we are, we can be better. And that, if we have a different kind of governance arrangement, Peter is right, it is about governance. And we need that process of how we make decisions to be improved so that we can get better outcomes.
Thank you, Prof. Now we'll ask Jeanette Calder to pose her question, and then we will go to Anika Lewison afterwards.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Kelly. Night to everybody. Thank you to the discussants. It's a comment and hopefully ending on a question. But yeah, I really want to thank Professor Hamilton. Between her and Gordon Robinson's articles over the years, that is really what has gotten me invested in the whole matter of constitutional reform. And I remember when I came home in 2012, a big research I took on my own is just to see how we got here. I remember a Bill Johnson poll that was done around 2011 that had asked Jamaicans if we had to do it all over again, would we want to be separated from, was independence a bad idea? And it was a high number of Jamaicans that had said it was a bad idea, and I felt really terrible. But Mr. Kelly, more so because if the survey had asked me, I would have been one of those. So I came home trying to find out whose idea this was and what they really had in mind. And it really struck me that from 1936, when the idea originated in Harlem, it took 8 years before we got to the 1944 shift in governance. And then it took 18 more years for us to get the 1962 constitutions. Now we've been at it for 60 years. Smarter, brighter people, and yet 6 decades. I want to share with everybody who's here, and it's really good to see some of the folks are always seeing these constitutional discussions because it means that they're still committed. That what happened with the DPP earlier this year and the way in which the government went about it in light of our having a mechanism called the Constitutional Reform Committee, bypassing them and bypassing a ministry, heading to the Minister of Justice to bring this motion on a constitutional position. Really, I lost confidence in the process, Mr. Kelly. I haven't lost confidence in the people of Jamaica, which is why I'm here tonight, but I have lost confidence in the sincerity of the government. I feel as if this is a vanity project. And so what I wanted to share tonight is while I was listening to Rosie and Vanos and everybody, I asked myself the question, how much are we spending on this project? So I quickly took a look at the last 3 budgets, and I just wanted us to get a little context of the money, because though I'm not speaking tonight as JAMP, but as a citizen, I just wanted to share with you what is it we have spent so far in terms of what we have gotten. The Ministry of Legal and Constitutional Affairs between the last 2 financial years, $1.6 billion of our hard-earned tax dollars. And in another 3 months, it's going to become 2.5 billion. What have we gotten for that spend? If you compare it to cabinet office for the same period is 1.3 billion to become 1.9. If you compare it to the National Land Agency, 1.7 to become 1.8 in 3 months. If you look at the office of the DPP, it's 1.4 to become 1.2. So I'll repeat, how much have we projected? $1.6 billion already on this ministry. And we're gonna, in the next 3 months, move that up to 2.5. I am not seeing value for money. And so because of the work JAM does on public financial accountability, I'm not here to discourage anybody. I still believe, as Rosalie just said, in the people of Jamaica. We have more going for us than the folks in the 1930s and in the 1950s. But I am trying to give us some context, Mr. Kelly, to say that we have to get some value for this money. We bypassed the Ministry of Justice that had a legal and constitutional affairs department. We've granted this a new minister and a new building, and we're paying for it. And so I'm just saying to everybody, let's dig deep, let's come up with a plan, because if not for us, this is not going to end up where we want it. So it turns out, Mr. Kelly, that was more a comment than a question.
Yes, it was. But thank you for your intervention. Rosalie, you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, I would just quickly say to Jeanette, I fully agree we need value for money. And this is where I would just want to appeal to Jamaicans that, listen, you know, this matter of public education, here are some good things that has happened. The government has put on the table the need for Jamaica to have comprehensive constitutional reform. That's a good thing. They've opened the space. Now, are we going to do that, what we typically do, which is sit back and make government make it happen? Or do we roll up our sleeves and get involved? If we want a constitution to reflect who we are, to reflect our will, to make us sovereign, then we need to start to act now, you know, and therefore holding the ministry and the minister accountable for what they have, what they set up to do, to guide and lead this constitutional reform is an important part of that. And I know many of the advocates have been out there making the point, we need more public education, and not just calling on the government for public education, but to actually get involved in holding forums like these. And I think we need to continue to do that. And so I like to point the finger at us. What are we, the people of Jamaica, going to do to ensure that we get our money's worth?
Thank you, Prof. Hamilton. Professor James?
Well, the wisest people that I know of in the entire Caribbean space are Jamaicans. And I think the nature of the conversation that is going on here tonight is encouraging to me. If you want value for money, then you have to get involved in the political process of winning it. You're not going to, kind of hinting at what Pat was saying earlier, the entrenched interests in the country that have run it the way it's been run for the longest while are not likely to want to give Jeanette the value for money she's looking for, which is not just in that ministry, but across all the spaces. So you, the people of Jamaica, have to get political. You have to do what I do every day. Campaign for what I want. I represent my interests all over Trinidad and Tobago, especially in Tobago. Walk up and down, go to the homes, talk to people as a fellow citizen about where we are and where we really ought to go. And no election comes around when I don't jump on a platform and campaign for the kind of change that I want. And I don't think you're going to get constitutional reform of the kind that Jeanette really sounds like she wants, unless you make up your mind to campaign for it. Meaning walk up and down all over Jamaica and talk to people about it and win the elections, or put your people who you think will push for change in power and ring-fence them with real hardcore politics besides. So this is not a simple thing that you have a party in power or a government in power and they deliver. It's we, the people, who have to work for what we want. Democracy is not easy, it's not cheap, and it's not given to you. You have to earn it, win it, fight for it every day into eternity.
Thanks a lot, Prof. James. Thanks a lot for that intervention. At this stage, we want to call on to Anika Lewinson Morgan. You've got a question?
Hello, this isn't Annika, this is Ken, on her behalf. Is that okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm a Jamaican citizen, regular Jamaican citizen. So the way I understand it is we're going to have a referendum to determine a republic, and we're going to get rid of the monarchy and elect a president, I presume. I guess there are people who want an appointed president. I think we could probably do better with an elected president. And I don't think, well, people say all the time, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but you can engineer the rim. There are systems, there are places around the world. Singapore comes to mind, where they have elected presidents, and the president is not ceremonial. Ceremonial plus, sorry, ceremonial plus. The president has a function. One of the functions is to be responsible for a sovereign wealth fund. I think it's very important for Jamaica, in light of the recent media reports about oil and so on that on the South Coast, 2-point-something million barrels that might come into production maybe in about 4 or 5 years' time. And by having somebody in charge, uniquely and solely responsible for something like that, we have a functional head of state. And I'd be interested to hear what the experts would say of pros and cons of a situation like that. Trying to avoid the Dutch disease, where you have rapid development in one sector, and then that could probably harm the internal economy. Yeah, so I'd be interested in hearing what the experts would say. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Hamilton and Professor James, which one of you would like to take that question?
Well, I would, I hear the talk, even in my own country, about an elected president, and I give it a lot of thought because erudite people raise it, like they're doing in Jamaica too. But when I think about it, I cannot think about it in a vacuum and say, well, we want an elected president, because the kind of arrangements we have with these appointed governor generals and presidents not working for us. You have to remember two things. One is they're not working for us under the constitutional arrangements we have in place today, in which they are effectively responsive to those who appoint them. And they're not there in a context in which the real power in the society lies in the population's hands and in the elected representatives of the people, as against the authoritarian cabinet. Oh. So you can't forget that. The second thing you can't forget is when you talk about electing a president, you're heading down a certain kind of road in an authoritarian society. And that is this. The elected president will be the only person in your jurisdiction who has a national mandate. Everybody else will have a mandate for a constituency. Your elected president will be the only one who would be able to say, Jamaican people tell me so. Who are you in Trelawney to disagree with? When the people of Jamaica tell me this. And you're going to have to come up with a way to deal with that story when you're dealing with real authoritarianism. And the history of the Caribbean is that authoritarianism not easy to deal with. So you hand full power, elected executive power, to a person with national mandate. You've got to cook up devices to constrain and control the policymaking process and the exercise of executive power by that person. And that's what the Americans found out when they invented the American constitutional arrangements. That's what Jefferson meant by saying you don't want a king, you have to have checks and balances, that sort of thing. Well, for them, coming out of a world in which they stole a continent, they could design something that would work that way, but they don't have an authoritarian culture to deal with. We have one, and we have to be very careful not to hand excessive power to people until you know how you're going to constrain and control it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. James?
If I can quickly add, sorry, if I can just quickly add to that, you know, we have evidence from the Black Ops studies that have shown that a few years ago, Jamaicans were much more supportive of a authoritarian dictatorial solution to our crime problem than we were supporting a democracy. And it's a very telling piece of information because we want quick solutions. And as this crime problem gets worse, everybody wants quick, fast solutions and are warming to the idea that, you know, we can, you know, get rid of certain rights and just get quick answers. And we've seen others across the world, in El Salvador and so on, use those methods. So we have to be very, very careful because we have a double-edged sword. We're not only trying to fix a governance arrangement, we're doing it in a social context in which not only are people facing low standard of livings, emigrating as a result, but tackling with social issues, especially crime.
Yes.
We all want quick answers.
Yeah. At this juncture, I'd say thank you, Professor Hamilton. The discussion has taken us beyond 8 p.m. And so I'm going to say we have to close the question and answer section. And at this juncture, we have to bring tonight's proceedings to an end. And so I will ask Professor Suzette Horton to bring us to a close. And sorry if we didn't get a chance to take your question. And I recognize that there was a robust discussion going on in the chat. We didn't have an opportunity to monitor that, but I understand that Dr. Northover was deeply involved in that. So I do hope you didn't feel too left out. But let me now hand over to Professor Suzette Horton.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly. We have learned a lot today about the political and the economic imperatives of constitutional change in Jamaica. The importance of crafting policies that foster competitiveness and innovation to improve outcomes that increase standard of living for our people. The importance of educating citizens to participate in a meaningful way in the constitutional process. Lots of food for thought. We appreciate all the insights, all the comments, all the questions, and of course your support and hard work that have made this forum a success. I extend special gratitude to Dr. Northover, supported by Dr. Biholar, for conceptualizing the collaborative partnership with the Department of Government, Legacies, Mona Law, and the Institute of Law and Economics, and of course, for proposing this important forum on Jamaica's constitutional reform. Special gratitude is also extended to Prof. Henke, the director of Salises, and his team at Salises, particularly Mr. Richard Leach for coordinating the technical and the program logistics for this forum. Dr. Christopher Malcolm, Interim Dean from Mona Law, and Professor Rosalie Hamilton, thank you for agreeing to partner on this forum. Special thanks also to Mr. Dwayne Gottsmere, the CEO of the Institute of Law and Economics, for his excellent program development support. This forum, of course, benefited from the expertise of Professor Rosalie Hamilton as our main speaker, Professor Vanus James as our panelist, and the forum was moderated by Dr. Leslie Kelly. I extend gratitude to Profs. Hamilton and James and Dr. Kelly for the stimulating presentation, the discussion, and of course for the skillful moderation of the session. To you, our audience, thank you for gracing us with your presence. Once again, may I express thanks to our partners and to the audience for the instrumental support, and we look forward to greater partnerships, more fruitful and insightful forums in the future. I wish you all the best for the festive season and good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. All the best for the festive season.